Good morning, everyone. I think we should, from now on, do all tech conferences by candlelight. Our live stream is down, Brad, so you can say anything you want.
I know, I was very excited about this.
So you're coming to us not directly, but not long off the heels of a visit to the Vatican, where you met with the Pope and discussed artificial intelligence. And I have to ask, what interest does the Pope have in AI?
Well, it's actually a quite substantial interest, not only by Pope Francis, but by other leaders at the Vatican. And it was an interesting visit. It had its share of ironic timing, if you will, because I was going from the Vatican straight to Munich for the Munich Security Conference to meet with military leaders. And we were talking about ethics, and the Vatican has obviously had its share of ethical issues it's been grappling with over the last couple of weeks. But when you step back and think about it, part of what we're trying to do is bring technology to humanity, and part of what the Vatican is focused on is bringing humanity to technology. So this intersection is really quite profound, if you will. And it really cuts in part to the heart of what kind of ethical issues should guide the development of artificial intelligence. And I also think it's worth putting in the context of what has really been a centuries-long tension at times between science and technology on the one hand, and ethics or philosophy or faith or religion on the other. And this, at times, technology's advanced religion. Gutenberg did that with the Bible. At times, it's collided with Galileo. So it was a very thoughtful opportunity to have a good conversation.
And as I understand it, you came out of there with a pledge to use artificial intelligence, quote, at the service of human life.
That is something that we're striving to do. To mostly find new ways to enable technology to serve humanity, if you will.
Well, I'm sure that's music to the ears of some of your employees who in recent years and months have raised questions about just how Microsoft technology is being used. Last year, famously, this really got going when questions were raised about the use of Microsoft technology at ICE. Where do you at Microsoft draw the line about what your technology should and shouldn't be used for?
Well, we've had to deal with it in the last year in the context of ICE and obviously in the context of the military as well. And one thing we have said is that we will provide our technology to democratically elected governments that broadly focus on the protection of human rights. We will do that because we want these governments to have access to technology. We believe they need to have access to technology. But we also recognize that there are important ethical issues that will arise. And we will use our voice as a corporate citizen to not just actively but proactively engage on the issues of the day. But we don't think that technology companies are rightly in the business of regulating democratically elected governments. We think democratically elected governments should be in the business of regulating technology companies, not the other way around.
And what is your response then to employees who say, well, and here I'm going to quote a letter that was addressed to you and Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, recently, from employees who were concerned about a new contract that would be working, allowing Microsoft HoloLens technology to be in headsets potentially worn by soldiers on the battlefield. And they said, we did not sign up to develop weapons. This has crossed the line into weapons development, and, quote, intent to harm is not an acceptable use of our technology.
Well, the first thing I would say is one thing we said last fall, because we had a broad conversation with our employees, and we said, we're going to provide our technology to the US military. The US military is responsible for defending the freedoms of our country, and we benefit from those freedoms, and we are going to stand behind the people who are risking their lives to protect our country. Second, we'll be active in addressing the ethical issues that arise. And third, if an employee doesn't want to work on a project, hey, it's a big company. We have a dedicated team working on a $480 million contract with the United States Army. Every single person on that team has volunteered to serve on that team. They've done it knowing exactly what the team is working on. And people who haven't wanted to work on that have had so many other choices. But I'll also say this. I think that this technology that we're creating, augmented reality-based glasses for troops, is important. It's going to improve the training of American soldiers. It is going to, in the future, enable troops to go into a setting. It's going to reduce, we believe, the risk of casualties from friendly fire, because it's going to provide additional information for soldiers so they know who else is on the battlefield. It'll provide information on buildings and what's behind a door. There will be a day in the future when this technology will help American soldiers rescue hostages. This is what we should be providing to the people who are risking their lives to protect and defend us.
Mm-hmm. It still seems, though, that there may be a feeling of a bait and switch in some employees. And I just wonder how you're addressing that with them. People who say, we came to work for the maker of Windows and Office, and all of a sudden we feel like our company is evolving into a defense contractor.
Well, I mean,
would you ever, for example, set up a Microsoft defense unit to segment this and make it very clear where an employee is working for?
We'll see what the future brings in terms of the right organizational structure. But look, I remember going on a tour of the USS Nimitz 8 or 9 years ago, an aircraft carrier that had over 4,000 Windows servers running on it. No one should be surprised to learn that every military in the world actually uses computers. And most of these computers actually run off-the-shelf software, and most of the world's off-the-shelf software comes from American technology companies. So it's not a newsflash here.
Perhaps not such a new problem. The JEDI contract is still out. Can you give us an update on where that stands and how you're thinking about that? Because as we understand it, a lot of how JEDI would be used is something we certainly, and perhaps employees even, wouldn't even be aware of.
Well, I mean, the JEDI contract, for people who haven't been immersed in defense contracting, is the Pentagon's focus on migrating to the cloud. And so Microsoft submitted a bid, Amazon submitted a bid, Oracle filed a protest, and that protest actually continues to be in the news. Well, we'll see what it brings in terms of the ins and outs, but fundamentally what you see is the Pentagon, like every part of the United States government, and frankly virtually every part of every government, asking, how do we migrate to the cloud? And that is fundamentally what the JEDI contract will enable. It's going to reduce costs. It's going to increase agility. It's obviously the future. And naturally, we, Amazon, most companies in the tech sector want to be part of that future. You
mentioned earlier that you view it not as the responsibility of companies to tell a democratically elected government what to do, but for a democratically elected government to regulate large technology companies. And in fact, in recent months, you've actually called for regulation, specifically of facial recognition technology. Now, from students of the history of Microsoft, it's perhaps shocking to hear the company calling for regulation, but can you give us a sense of why you actually believe on this one issue it's so important?
Yeah, and the first thing I would say is I actually think it's fine for us to tell governments, but I think it's a mistake for us to think that we should regulate governments. But to answer your question, yeah, we called for new laws to regulate facial recognition technology. And we're both very excited about this technology. If you look at how algorithms are performing in various testing, ours tend to be at the top for facial recognition. And we have concerns, because this is a space where there has been well-documented problems with bias that can easily lead to discrimination against different people. It can lead to, I think, invasions of people's privacy. It can even put fundamental democratic freedoms at risk if it is used in a pervasive way for ongoing surveillance of specific individuals. We don't want to see a commercial race to the bottom. Like every AI-based market, it can tip based on who has the most data, meaning who wins the most deals. And yeah, I just don't think it's healthy for the world, and it's certainly not healthy from our perspective as a competitor if the company with, just call it the least focus on the broad social issues ends up winning all the deals. And so we've said law is needed. We don't have all the answers, but specifically we've said that there ought to be a requirement under the law that if you want to enter this market, you should make you should be obligated to make your technology available for third-party testing, so the Consumer Reports of the world, if you will, can evaluate them. There ought to be some privacy protections. There ought to be restraints on how law enforcement uses it. And if you start to take these kinds of steps, you put in place the foundation for what I think is a much more responsible approach.
And you're making some progress at the state level, is that right?
We are. I mean, basically, I gave a speech in December in Washington, D.C. We laid out a proposal. And there's a bill making its way through the Washington state legislature right now. We'll see how far it gets, but it passed recently out of a Senate committee with these kinds of provisions in it.
It may take longer in Washington, as things tend to do.
Yeah.
In the meantime, though, Microsoft has set up a board of ethics internally to regulate or self-govern some of your engagements with AI. I wonder if you could give us a sense of what that board looks like. I know you're involved in it. Mm-hmm. And where, can you tell us, you've actually put the brakes on some projects?
Well, a couple of thoughts here, because I think it's been really powerful learning for us, and I have to say the learning is continuing on a daily basis. We started by identifying ethical issues for artificial intelligence and establishing some broad principles. And they're in 6 areas. It ranges from bias to inclusion. We address privacy. We address reliability, transparency, and accountability. So we started with this sense of we want to be thoughtful and we want to be principled. Of course, once you do that, you say, okay, now I'm going to have principles. How do I implement these principles? Because I think one of the real challenges for any tech company, and it's true whether you're small, it's even more challenging if you're large and global, is you actually have to follow the principles that you set out. So we're actually creating an entire governance system. You've got to turn principles into policies. You've got to have people whose job it is to interpret them. You've got to create training programs for employees. You need to put compliance systems in place. So we're doing all of that in a variety of areas, including facial recognition, where we're not only calling for legislation, but we're applying these principles voluntarily. But then to answer your question, at the end of the day, if you never say no, then the principles probably don't have that much substance to them. And the facial recognition space is one where we've turned down deals. We've been public and shared that we turned down a deal last year where a government in a country which, in our view, was not protecting human rights adequately, wanted to deploy facial recognition broadly in a manner that we thought would chill freedom of expression.
Which government was that?
We haven't identified the government by name for sort of obvious reasons.
A government.
A government, yeah. We also turned down a deal from a law enforcement agency here in California. We haven't said which one. But
which one?
We haven't said which one. But basically what they wanted to do was deploy a facial recognition system so that it would be on the web, on the camera, the body cam of every police officer, and then would be on the dashboard camera of every car. And their thinking was that everybody who was pulled over for any kind of traffic violation, they would scan, they'd run it through a facial recognition system, and if it led to a match, they'd take the person downtown for further questioning. And we looked at that and said, look, this technology is just not ready for this. The risk of errors is too high. It's going to have results that are more likely to discriminate against women and people of color. It's not a deal that we were comfortable doing. What I found most interesting about that episode is we decided internally that we would say no. We said no, but then we talked to the police department and we said, look, we're saying no, but this is why. We don't think it makes sense for us to provide this to you, and frankly, we don't think it makes sense for you to deploy this technology from anybody at this point, given the nature of the state of its development. And so we've had a really good conversation, and we're learning together, and we said we'll continue to work on how the technology evolves. But I just think that at the end of the day, you can learn a lot from the decisions you make not to go forward, especially if you then follow them up with these kinds of efforts.
So did they just go to Amazon? I mean,
no.
Why wouldn't this be a race to the bottom in this case?
Well, in this case, the interesting thing, especially when you're talking about bias and discrimination, no customer really wants to deploy a facial recognition system that's biased. It has error rates. They understand that it's going to put them in a challenging position. So I think they actually appreciated the fact that we didn't just sell them what they wanted to buy. Yeah. And they didn't go somewhere else, and we said, let's work together to think about how this technology might evolve.
So you mentioned that from the Vatican you went to Munich. Mm-hmm. And in Munich, we were discussing backstage that it was your sense that the global perception of US technology companies has started to change in some meaningful ways in recent years. And I wonder if you could share some of those thoughts.
Yeah, it's a very interesting and to some degree challenging time, especially if you go to an event like the Munich Security Conference, which mostly brings together the military leaders. It started of the NATO members, but it's really become quite global. And one of the things that you see is a very different relationship between, say, Western Europe and the United States government compared to what existed 5 years ago. There's a lot more tension between the United States and its NATO allies than there was in the past. There's less willingness in some countries in Western Europe to just follow the US government's lead or even to trust the US government. And then you put that in the context of technology. If you're a government today, you're making decisions that are going to fundamentally determine how your government operations work, because it all has to be automated. It all has to work on technology. You're trying to decide, like the Pentagon and the JEDI contract, do you move to the cloud? What kind of cloud do you move to? And then you drop that into the middle of lots of active trade debates. And so if you're a Western European government, you ask, wait a second, is there going to come a day when the United States government might apply some sanctions that would restrict my ability to continue to upgrade my technology? Do I have to worry about where my citizens' data is going to go? Do I feel comfortable with my data going into a data center that is run by a company that is headquartered in the United States? All of these are very live, real questions that a number of governments are asking. And so I think it's a good illustration of how the geopolitical issues of the day end up impacting real business for technology companies.
Is it costing Microsoft business yet?
I think it is not necessarily costing us business, but it is pushing us to figure out how to address these concerns. And if we cannot address these concerns, then I think it's going to move business away from not just Microsoft, but US technology companies to more local companies. And then you have to worry about it being sort of put in the context of what can feel like protectionist pressures as well.
Mm-hmm. And how do you even do that? How do you start to try to address these issues when so much of the cause of these concerns are frankly out of your hands?
Well, you really have to sit down and, the first thing you have to do is really understand what is bothering people.
Yeah.
And you've got to translate that not into the geopolitics of the day, but the hardcore technical issues. What does it mean for how our systems are architected? What does it mean for who operates a data center in a particular country? What does it mean for data flows? And ultimately, you have to think about solutions that are going to satisfy people who are very sophisticated, not just in thinking about international relations, but then thinking about technical details.
Mm-hmm. We're going to go to questions in just a few minutes, but I have to ask, Microsoft has been in Seattle for a long, long time. The housing crisis in Seattle is getting worse. Mm-hmm. You've pledged $500 million to try to help alleviate that crisis. And yet other companies, including some of your neighbors, have taken a very different approach with local governments. What is your thinking on the responsibility of a big tech company to their local communities right now? And specifically, and if you could answer this first, what did you make of Amazon's walk back in New York City?
Let's talk about Seattle rather than New York. No,
we'll come back to New York.
Yeah. The first thing to note is that we've experienced, especially over the last 5 years in the Seattle area, growth comparable to, say, San Francisco, Northern California. And the impact on housing has really been unfortunate. It manifests itself most visibly in a homelessness crisis. And of course, there's no one who has a bigger problem when it comes to housing than people who have no home. But the problem, in fact, is a lot broader than that. There's not enough low-income housing, and there's not enough middle-income housing. And so what it is fundamentally doing is pushing many people to live much farther away from where they work. So you have police officers, you have teachers, you have nurses that are having to endure commutes of 3 to 4 hours a day. And I think it's just sapping the vitality and health of our communities. So for us as a company, we said, look, we're part of this growth. We have grown in part because we have benefited, in our view, from tremendous support of this community. We are extraordinarily grateful for the support we have received from this community. we should do something to try to help solve this problem. And we are in a very fortunate position because we have a balance sheet that enables us to put capital to work. And so we then said two things. One, we're going to put our capital to work with a $500 million pledge. Some of it is philanthropic money, but the vast majority is loans and investments to stimulate housing supply. But the other thing that we found when we really studied work across the country, including down here and around the world, is that no one has really solved this problem without strong public sector leadership to change the kinds of public policies that really go to the heart of whether low and middle income housing units get built. And so what we did is we worked with a group called Challenge Seattle, a former governor, Chris Gregoire, and we were able to get 9 mayors to come together. And on the same day where we pledged this money, they pledged their support to explore and pursue 7 specific public policy reforms. So, it's not going to solve the whole problem. It's like all things in life. You don't know how much you'll actually accomplish, but we think it's a positive path. And other companies choose different approaches for themselves, but I think every company today has to decide what kind of company do you want to be. And we decided that the right thing for us, with our relationship with the community where we've mostly grown up, is to support the community. And the only thing we're asking the community to do is to pursue public policies that will build more houses for more people.
Mm. And so what do you think of what Amazon did in New York?
Well, it's not a path you're going to see us pursue. It's not. We wouldn't be comfortable doing that. I think that, look, when you're a company that is as large as the leaders are in our industry, you have to recognize that it's great to bring jobs to a community. I mean, it's wonderful. It's a high-class problem for a community to have. But you're also going to create a dynamic where communities need to build more schools. They're going to need to add to their transportation infrastructure. You're going to put new strains on the housing supply. And you have to decide, do you want to be part of the solution for those challenges or not? If you're going to be part of the solution, you got to spend some money, either in the form of taxes or other forms of spending. And I think that our industry has reached a point, especially for the industry leaders, where we're large enough and profitable enough to say, let's ask a little bit more of ourselves about what we can do for the communities in which we live, and not just ask the communities in which we live to do more for us.
Thank you. Do we have mic runners? Let's go to questions. Yeah, or we don't have mic runners because we don't have electricity. Aaron Kramer.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Brett.
Hi, Aaron.
I was delighted that you mentioned human rights earlier, and you've been a real leader, Microsoft has, on this. Why is it important to you, and what would you say to everyone in the room about how human rights can help us figure out how to make AI work for all of us?
Well, first of all, it's a great question, and it's one that I really think our industry needs to spend more time talking about. In the world today, I actually think there's few things that will have a greater impact on the state of human rights around the world than the application of technology. And I'm especially concerned about this in a couple of scenarios. One is, we're going to see more data centers in more countries around the world. More countries want more data centers within their borders. But that gives more governments the capability to really engage in, broad surveillance of individual citizens. Second, you're going to see technology like facial recognition, potentially applied not only in ways that are good, but ways that could put fundamental democratic freedoms and human rights at risk. So I think that really calls on us, first of all, to understand these issues better. We are an industry that needs to move fast, but we shouldn't move faster than the speed of thought. And therefore, really, understanding the human rights issues and risks are of fundamental importance. Second, I think that our industry will serve itself best if we can rally together to uphold certain human rights standards. And that will, I think, lead to days when, certainly we as a company say, you know what, we're not going to put a data center in a particular country. That is something that I am involved in frequently at Microsoft. Or we're only going to put a data center in a country, but not certain kinds of data in that country. And it's another place where I worry about races to the bottom. And so I think the industry coming together makes sense. Third, I think we need to work more collaboratively with like-minded governments. And I think that the future protection of human rights is going to require, let's just say, to start with the democratic governments of the world and tech companies to rally around a common set of international norms. It will not solve every question because you have technology coming from other companies, it's in other countries, it's going into other nations, but you need a bulwark, a foundation that sets a standard that then enables you to have a conversation. And I think we should all worry greatly that if we don't think these things through, we'll end up as a planet repeating some of the great tragedies of the past. And if you want to understand the great tragedies of the past, go to Berlin, because there you saw what technology did in the 1930s with the Nazis. You can see what the Stasi did between 1945 and 1989 with the largest, most sophisticated surveillance system before wide-scale information technology. We need to keep these things in mind.
We are out of time, but I'm going to read one quote from a letter you wrote recently, and those will be your last words out of my mouth. You said, all tools can be used for good or ill. Even a broom can be used to sweep the floor or hit someone over the head. The more powerful the tool, the greater the benefit or damage it can cause. Thank you for your thoughts today, Brad.
Thank you. Thank you.